We have some guests for the session today. In the sense of having a bit of a creative meeting and share ideas and stimulate each other somehow. I know everybody's in a different location in the world. Nicole is joining us from India. Kathleen and Maf'j, you're both in England, and Manuela and myself, we are in Mallorca, in Spain. How do we represent and how do we establish the virtual landscape, digital spaces as spirituality? But also, perhaps more readily, what are the potentialities of its use? We're all artists. The angle of how we're going to be talking about the virtual world today, which is more about an instrument. By pushing this analogy of virtual and potential, and perhaps equating the two of them, find novel ways, imagine how the virtual can participate beyond the way it is participating today, understanding of reality, participatory aspect of reality, not as an alternative to it. These sessions are related to hostartist.network, which is an instrument we've been developing to generate links, create process within society.
I am an artist. I'm pretty much concerned by creative processes in the field of performing art, performance, theater, movie, rethinking how my everyday life and its choreography can change as well as a mother, as educator of my children. I am a choreographer and a performer with the Chocolat Association as a producer. So creativity and its boundary is slightly invading all the processes, fundings processes, organizations.
Thank you, Manuela, and thank you, Felix. I'm in Brighton, UK, by the sea. It was raining earlier, it's a bit grey. I'm a digital media artist, I'd say, and a creative technologist and a user experience designer. So I'm going to say those three things because they feed into each other. But I do have a particular fascination for technology, delight working with technology as a collaborator rather than against it. I'm currently working in virtual reality. So I engage myself partly in early stage prototyping. So I've identified a kind of space for myself which feeds into the user experience design aspect, where decisions are being made, where visions are being formed, where before the technologists lay down the foundations of the mechanics of the piece, where we can still play. So for me, purposeful play is a very important idea. And that's why I'm excited by being here and hearing all about you guys and how you all work. Explore when ideas are not locked into mechanics is very important. I've run a small collective called Incubate Immersive, which is aiming to diversify and democratize the tooling around virtual reality. We don't have to spend a lot of money and a lot of time just having a go and creating experimental playful experiences, so we can, in one afternoon, a bunch of people get together and do something.
I'll start when I was at, doing an MA at the Slade in the 80s, and there was a whole department around this notion of code as art. So really early on, looking at the kind of materiality of, the algorithm, thinking about binary code in a very abstract process way, coming out of conceptual art. That was really formative. I went, in a sense, from this very beginning, and I've kind of always crossed over. I've worked with performance, early video art, this idea of the kind of expanded cinema. And then in the 90s, I was fortunate enough to get invited to Banff, the Banff Centre for the Arts, on a bioapparatus residency, which was extraordinary. And, I was a young mother, an independent parent. This was huge for me to go away for 10 weeks, probably hugely irresponsible, just saying, it's a huge opportunity and a very dramatic conflict. I got some funding from the BFI. I set up a VR consultancy when there was no VR. So moving swiftly on, 30 years later, it feels like 30 years later. One, I'm delighted to have met up with Maf'j through a colleague, you know, from the university that I teach at, and hopefully we're going on to do something. So I wanted to kind of pick up, in a sense, pick up some speed, because at the time, you can imagine 30 years ago, nobody had VR. You know, it's totally an elitist thing. So I'm really interested in the fact that, you know, there's lots of opportunities to, you know, around, you know, building VR kit, using generics, and building experience. And philosophically, I'm interested in this idea of there being kind of, in a sense, a palimpsest of worlds. So worlds within worlds, you know, the mental world, the physical world, embodiment, sensory. So I'm interested that there's so many, you know, that both, you know, Manuela and Nicole are coming from dance.
So I'm a choreographer. I used to be a dancer. I'm not really dancing anymore, even though I'm still very active. At the moment, I'm in India on a residency. And actually, as we speak, I just got to Mysore, where I'm going to do some yoga for a week. So I must admit also that I'm a little bit fed up with the digital world at the moment. So I feel the need to, you know, meditate and do yoga and be connected to my body and my senses and the smells around me and other real people. And I have worked a lot with new technologies, different technologies, a lot with video projections in the beginning. I also worked with motion capture, with live cameras. I did an audio walk with an app. For me, it's like a tool, like one more tool to use. So it like broadens the possibilities. Like using a wig or using a costume. My next project is going to be around dance and AI. I would like to, we did some tryouts before Christmas. The idea is to create an AI choreographer who will create for dancers a choreography live in front of an audience.
Start by defining certain things in a way, and perhaps asking the question, to what extent is the virtual tied to cultural phenomena? Today, we define virtual immediately with something which is digital, something which is intangible, of course. Virtual comes from virtus, somehow is defined as the potency, the dynamic aspect of something which has a possibility of being or existing, accessible to the sense of transformation.
I'm aware that, you know, it's established within gaming. I'm aware, you know, how it's being used therapeutically, how it's being used in dance. Within the university, we have, you know, a well-facilitated games course, you know, which has the motion capture, flock of birds. Then we have the conceptual development. You know, it's coming together into the, you know, the metaverse. We're going to see that, you know, all the issues around, you know, Zuckerberg's and the Facebook and the surveillance and, you know, how our data is being captured, you know, the kind of world that will be presented to us to inhabit, or worlds. You know, I think it's going to happen very quickly, in a sense, that we will be the rather like Chalmers says in his book, Virtual Reality Plus, you know, I feel like we become like the meat, you know, within the matrix. So it's our data, it's our bodies that will be harvested, our behaviors, you know, our psychological responses. And, you know, and I think that goes very deep. So on one hand, I'm not saying that's totally dystopic, because at the same time, you know, one can quickly find research into therapeutic, life-enhancing, rather positive uses of that kind of data. You know, it throws me back to what used to be the heads-up display human interface research, you know, in the you know, in the 80s in particular. And all that was done, you know, on fighter pilots, you know, the kind of how can you enhance the human being's cognitive abilities to quickly respond and react at high speed to hit a target. You know, so this idea of the, you know, the body under surveillance, the senses, the physiological, looking again at Chalmers' book, which I haven't got through, but he talks about techno-philosophy. And I think that's where artists, in a sense, find sometimes, I'm not saying all artists, but sometimes find that space, that thinking space, for instance, to think about consciousness, that response between the stimulus, the response, kinesthesiology, the proprioceptive sense, that type, that's quite interesting, which can be transformative, you know, like any body. I don't do a lot of body work. We've mentioned yoga. I know you're doing Kung Fu every day for hours and hours. For 10 years, I did do the Alexander technique,
yes.
you know, which was at the time when I was working with early VR, and that really helped me. That really did. That felt important, actually.
Nicole, you were talking about the need, because you work with virtual digital environments, to move the body somehow, or to move even the audience, to relate and to bring together, like we're doing right now, geographical distances as well, you know, to generate narratives as well, relationships of ideas, and out of these relationships create new ones. A lot of the work that you've done is related to a projection of the virtual towards the body, no?
Well, I took the VR into parapsychology. The psychology department in the 90s had a early VR kit, you know, and it was easy to make that analogy between the extended senses, the telepathic space, you've named the kind of cosmovision, you know, of this altered consciousness, or this wide, you know, larger consciousness, as though technology, this utopian vision of it was, because I worked with Roy Ascott too, you know, who was coming with texts, you know, his teaching texts were coming out of Indian philosophy, something very esoteric. And so he was envisioning the internet as this participatory, collective, you know, almost Gaian vision, let's say, of how humanity was going to come together. Like Nicole said, you get fed up with digital. So I did work with outside broadcasts, thermal imaging, you know, mediums, thinking about how somebody who has a mediumistic belief system reaches, you know, does a kind of deep reach, which is somehow at the cusp of the imagination, you know, it's a projection, or is it, you know, what is this porosity between belief and reality?
Is the virtual merely digital? Nicole, what is your, I mean, how would you position the work that you've done today with the digital and the virtual environments, which is naturally progressing towards AI somehow, you know, which is pretty much a projection of the actual self on the digital and the virtual environment of humanity, the body experience, and how that's affected you?
Well, I agree with you. Digital and virtual is not really exactly the same thing. It's still true that neither the virtual, neither the digital has a body. Neither AI has a body. That only the human has a body, or like the organic world has a body. And still, I mean, dance is my first love. And so the body is my first love. And probably wasn't conscious of that when I started to be fascinated with technology, but the fleshness of the body, the presence of the body is what interests me in contrast with technology. A quote that I've been using, it says, we often say that theater is about the performer. When we think of the performer, we think of real performer. But when we look at the theatrical heritage, we realize that theaters involve heterogeneous presences that are largely non-human presences, gods, angels, ghosts, and spectra. I mean, I said I'm in India and yoga and all that, but actually people who know, who have neighbors who have not stepped out of their house in 2 years. So it's much more, actually, it's much more extreme here than in Europe.
And the way also Hindu religion touches on gods and the virtuality of gods as well as potential for human experience. Losing our bodies, perhaps more than projecting our bodies towards the virtual. We're also feeding through AI a sense of body of its own, and through physical attachments to the virtual and sensible world. No? So Manuela, going towards this relationship with the body and how you relate with the virtual and the physical aspect of the virtual, and perhaps turning the cycle around. You've been working with Chinese culture, traditional and historical culture as well for the last several years, in which it talks about realization as a moment that corresponds to a great creative breath that allows to move from the project to the realization, from the latent to the potent somehow, no? Which pretty much is from the virtual to that which is being manifested.
I try to think about virtuality not as something that is outside, but something that is inside. Not like something that is an extension, but something that is a root. I was thinking about how can we imagine a world where all we think is already done. This is a world where there is no virtuality. If we think about ourselves, not as an individual, but as kind of the nature, like a big organism, and we are kind of vibrational waves into this nature, we can easily imagine how the virtuality can be something that is not after, but that is before. And it is what you were speaking about, Felix. It is this project, this actually our dimension. It is life, because life is not a series of products. It is potentiality. If you think something, it is done. This is the word without virtuality. And it is not here, it is maybe after or in another dimension. This is the dimension of perfection. If you think in French, I don't know in English, but the imparfait, what is not perfect, it means a time before. No, so it's what it is not conclude. We live actually in this unconcluded. So for me, life is virtual. The manifestation is always a mask. I'm always feeling that we are putting layers and layers and layers of different masks that allow us to connect, to feel the manifestation of something that is not yet manifested. What we do in performing art is exactly a virtuality. I mean, we are trying to redo something with our body, reenact, and the same we can do with the VR technology. I think there is a mistake is to call VR because this is the problem for me. This is the word. I use a lot of imagination as potential for feel the connection between this not yet concluded time that I'm living, and to approach and try to be conscious about, always more conscious about something that I can't touch. Like Nicole said, it is to reenact this virtuality that can bring us back to our possibility to connect with this completed dimension.
This digital reality, this virtual reality, this digital dimension, there's virtuality almost like a representation of our will to create. When you're moving, perhaps also there's this virtual as ideas, Eidon as form as well, which is also potential in all movement. There's 100 billion neurons, no, on the mind, and each neuron has thousands of connections with each other. It's something, there's more connections in the human mind than stars in our galaxy. Stepping into a sort of origin myths, is it possible to tie this creation of the digital environment also as a projection of our narcissistic desire of humanity?
My personal comprehension of the term narcissism is not as deep as it should be, perhaps. Maybe because I'm more narcissistic than I want to believe, so I shun away from it. But I think I've not really engaged myself in that discussion much. Recent discussions have turned towards our connection with the objects around us as a kind of energy exchange. So to love ourselves is to honor ourselves as much as we honor the plant that we water every day, or the cat that we feed, right? Like, if I honor myself and I love myself, I take care of myself. So there's a sense of self-preservation, of self-care, love towards oneself that is nurturing and keeps our bodies alive and our minds healthy, and our relationships with everything in the world, virtual or real, in balance. And I think for me, as I get older now and as my body starts to shout at me in a different way than when I had children, before I had a child, my body screamed different things. Now my body is telling me, take care of me, love me as much as you love the cat, as much as you love at least the plant, right? So I'm not going to neglect myself. I think virtual reality offers us an opportunity to bring that into alignment a little bit. We can actually learn from it. By making virtual worlds, I actually learned to appreciate the real world more. I must say that when I make virtual reality, often it's during the spring and summer, when I take photos of things in the real world, and then I turn them into objects in virtual reality. Or I use inspiration from seeing how the light falls across a tree and the shadows, and I sit under the canopy in the forest, in the park, and I just experience nature. But then at the same time, I'm thinking, how would I put this in VR? Because in the winter, when there is no tree and there's no sunshine, I miss it. So I kind of am using it for well-being. When you have the power to create anything, it's easy to start feeling the overwhelming sensation of power inside your body that you could do anything. And that power gives you the impression that, okay, so you can make anything. And I had that feeling when I did the Eva Quantica project. I could make anything in this world and in the virtual world. And so I began to have fear that what would I create if I could create anything? And also, what should I create? So there's a question of saying, it's not about what I want or how much I love myself, but I think, what good is it actually, for who? And then also the realization that I might have that question in my mind, but maybe other people have different questions in their minds, as in, how can I most exploit this power, or how can I use this power for the greatest benefit to my interests, right? And that's where I think, as a virtual maker or creator of anything that you can manifest into the world or imagine, you have that responsibility, but that's always in conflict. So as much as I love technology, I am desperate to go and live on a mountaintop somewhere and just, grow vegetables. So I can love nature more. I don't know if that's answer your question, but I think it's a complicated relationship.
But it does. Thank you. It does. And I think that's definitely, there's one of the things that I think about personally when I think about virtual as potential, is really helping us understand more what we are, what we're living as human experience right now. And you were saying, just by sitting under a tree to a certain sunlight and seeing and poetry and the visions of artists through the ages, and we're generating a sense of simplification of reality somehow towards the virtual landscape, whereas reality tends to become more complex as we progress in time. The work of this British neuroscientist Carl J. Friston, the free energy principle, which is applied to AI. The way it works, it's not about a progression of reinforcement learning towards a minimization of surprise, a sense of control that we want to achieve somehow, minimize surprise. Avatar comes from Hinduism. The Hindu god has no beginning, middle, or end, but he can be represented as an image, because as a representation of an image, he becomes accessible. and becoming accessible, then we can virtually and potentially relate to whatever Vishnu has to offer somehow, no? As a human trait and as a human possibility. We are related directly to these visions of gods, no? How do you engage with these things when you work, and when you were saying that you were working towards artificial intelligence?
What's the data set that goes into it? And the questions around those data sets, more than the imagery or for me, it's really what I'm interested in is the fact that AI doesn't have a body, and what she's fed with. Like, I find very interesting how the AIs that exists reflect our society, but like reflect them even in a less complex way. It's like a mirror of society, but that un miroir grossissant. I don't know how you would say that in English, like a mirror that makes everything bigger and more. So I'm interested in that, how the digital world is actually, and the internet is increasing social problems, is increasing racism, is increasing sexism, is increasing all those things. We tend to think that it's our savior, you know, technology is our savior, and sure, it's there to make some things better and easier, but it cannot save us. We have to do that ourselves. So I'm like more interested in those questions around the digital space at the moment, like also ethical questions as a user. What do you do with it? Again, most people just use those things without thinking what's behind and who's put things inside.
I think that where I'd like it to go is in a way that we can synthesize some of the learning that we can have. Like if you go into a virtual reality experience and data is presented to you in a format that you can perceive that you couldn't perceive before. So it's made visible what was invisible, and that brings you some amount of well-being, learning, otherwise good experience, that you can then take that into a sphere without the technology, in much the way that if you take a drug and it opens your mind, then you can potentially synthesize that experience outside of that. You can recall it, you can remember it, you can practice it, to have a more holistic real world experience. And rather than depending on it, right? It's like, you know, maybe we can leave it alone for a while and go into it almost like a medicine or something, but something that we have responsibility for in our lives. I hope that we have an opportunity to steer the future of where this is going. My worry is that we won't, because the history has shown us that people with good intentions don't always get very far. And, you know, so where does that leave you? It leaves you feeling a bit impotent, right? But you've got to do something. So the question is, what do you do? But I'd like to see it so that we're in better balance with it, so that we're not dependent on it. If it gets taken away, we don't cease to exist. We don't collapse into a pit of despair, you know, that we can go, oh, we didn't, you know, my phone broke. My life carries on, right? That's my personal feeling.
You spoke about making visible what is invisible, and now I'm remembering something that Nicole did. I couldn't see it live, but I read the description. I know you did a performance with where dancers were dancing in the darkness. And there were someone that were just describing what they were doing. No, that's another way that we can appreciate the possibility and to make visible what is invisible. And I come back to what Nicole you were said, and Maf'j, that yes, it depends on how we use the tool, how we relate with our life like a knife, and we all have a knife in our kitchen. And as well to say that I have this feeling. It is just to share something that I am sure you can share, you can live as well. And it's very simple, but I have this sensation that all is becoming very little, and there is this idea of see things through a lens that is making things bigger, but as well all is kind of concentrating. And I feel this, I hope the technology and the possibilities will soon become much more agile. And I hope my computer could become something that I can move in my space with my hands and my legs. And this is something that I'm feeling I'm missing. I'm kind of Maf'j. I know you creating stuff. Think of me, because I think that it is a big problem. I mean, in an algorithm, I mean, it's really simplification of life. It's not complexification of life. So it's going against our nature.
Kathleen, are we creating consciousness?
I don't know. I mean, I just think of that's huge telescope, the Hubble, the simulations, at CERN, they're all world simulations, but on a deeper grain, so I think the physics within the physics engine, for instance, that was remarkable when those, first animations, came into Adobe software. You thought, oh my God, that's a flume, that's water, that's fire, it's extraordinary. I think, you've got the visual system, and like you said, you've got the whole body system. But I mean, we've got bodies. I'd rather sort of step in and out and have this, what Heim calls this invisible trellis, where there's this sense that you're learning something, in a sense, by having the mind lead you to believe. There's something, for instance, worlds where you can fly. There's a way of stepping in and out of bodies and worlds, out as the way that, the gender, kind of, there's been this complete shift in terms of thinking about, the gendered body, the non-binary, all the different adjectives. And I can see that there's some very interesting slippage in terms of creating in those spaces. But again, we know it's going to be driven by consumption. It's going to be driven by consumers, and corporations going for the lowest denominator, isn't it?
That is certainly part of the problem that we're living. And I think nevertheless, we're living this. So that's also part of the deal. It's an opportunity as well. I mean, I think we're just getting started right now with with our talks, and I don't want to prolong it too much, but I want to invite Francesco and Eliane to participate as well with questions that you might have. And to finish off this little section with a quote of the Bhagavad-Gita, in the words of Krishna as God, who says, "Though I am unborn with unchanging self, I engage with material nature, which is mine, and come to be in time by my wondrous power. For whenever righteousness, dharma, wanes and unrighteousness is on the rise, I project myself into the world and take birth, age after age, to protect the good, destroy the wicked, and re-establish righteousness." There's always a sense of projecting our own selves. Perhaps this looking in the digital, in the virtual as potential, as humanity, is a way of trying to re-establish links with perhaps lost ways to perhaps a spiritual world, defining our creativity, our minds and our existence as that of being in relation with each other. and with nature. Thank you for joining us today and listening for this first hour of exchange.
My name is Francesco. It was very interesting listening to you. I'm a professor at the University of Applied Sciences in Sion, so I'm an engineer. I work a lot in artificial intelligence as a researcher, but also in human-computer interaction, so virtual reality, augmented reality. And many of my projects were related to health or social issues. Like right now, we have a project with virtual reality. We try to teach to young adults with intellectual deficiencies, like to learn to take the bus, take the train, cross the roads. And what we are aiming to understand, you were talking about teaching and learning before, Kathleen and Maalouf. The point is that what they learn in virtual reality, can they transfer this learning, these new skills to reality? Of course, there is the challenge with the handicap, for instance, in our case. Because for us, let's say, virtual reality brings the possibility to make several attempts in a controlled environment, like a safe, they do not really need to cross a road. So it's very useful to this virtual reality. In arts, what do you see? What's the future in arts? What brings virtual reality to you?
It takes for someone to be jumping in a different direction for you to realize where you are. And I think for me, being able to do things together, the world opened for me in virtual reality when it was about being together with another person. They were jumping this way, I was jumping this way, we nearly hit each other, but it wouldn't have mattered because we went through each other's bodies. So there's something about trying new things while you still can, without there being a real world impact on it. You know. So there's opportunity for practicing, for getting over trauma. And in the arts, I think, yeah, you play with a new technology, like the hand interaction has only just getting to the point with the Oculus Quest where you don't need a controller. They're releasing development kits, so prototyping kits that mean that we can start to experiment. And if you're not in the arts, if you're in engineering, you have to work towards a solution. Whereas in the arts, you don't have to force yourself towards a solution. What solution? We're hypothetically creating something and then saying, what would this be like? And I think for me, when I think as an artist, I think, let me explore this world and see where it could go. It's a different approach, you're opening new realities rather than say, oh, now we've got one, let's see what we can apply with it.
Yeah, I have also a more philosophical question. Because I remember talking with another professor doing a lot of research in virtual reality. It's about, he didn't like the term virtual. What is virtual? Because at a given point, our senses are like our doors to see the reality. And when we hack our senses with virtual reality, at a given point it becomes real. Also, the connection we are doing right now, I don't know if it's virtual or real, but sometimes also using social networks. The connection that we do becomes real. Virtual is already real. It's just another dimension that now we can access with technology or other things.
I kind of relate to the virtual as also part of the reality. I mean, reality as a whole.
We're looking, one of the themes on another project we might be working on is around psychedelics. How controversial it was in the 60s, Timothy Leary, Ken Kesey. There's documentaries on Netflix about it. It's part of the public domain. So this idea of pushing the boundaries of consciousness, and looking at autonomic, kind of visual systems, the firing, the hypnagogic, dream worlds. I mean, they're all real. I mean, I remember going to a lecture at the Architectural Association years ago, and Gordon Pask was giving a lecture. He was building systems for guided missiles. I'm not saying so, we're in a moral dilemma, predictive, working with kind of, chaos systems, math, formulating, I suppose, different simulated worlds and what ifs. It was so funny. He just said, everything you can imagine is real. Unicorns are real. As he dropped his pipe tobacco on his overhead projector, and it muddled up, his donut image of the multiverse. But he really did believe that anything that you could think, collectively and imagine, becomes part, we've talked about it in terms of memes, this idea that they become almost bits of reality. So I agree. I think I was looking at the VR worlds I made in '91, re-editing them to give a lecture. This is, you know, about them. And I was there, you know, I was in them still. You know, they're part of me, part of my memory. I think this idea of, you know, again, Chalmers tries to describe it, does it rather well, you know, the simulated worlds and worlds within the matrix. Are we living in the matrix? In a palimpsest.
Maf'j earlier was speaking about this virtualization of the hands is coming. Now there are some devices like filming the mouse, so you can talk, also your mouse move along. Do you think there are other limitations from the technology that needs to be overcome to be really actually more useful?
I've got a feeling it's not the lack of technology that's going to be the problem. I think the technology will always be there. It's more the adoption by a diverse enough group of people to make it good with this instrument and say, like, I'm interested enough to overcome the access point, you know, the hurdles. Currently, it's very, very limited in terms of who develops it. That's personally what my little mission. But even I'm about to fall off a cliff, I think, in terms of deciding I've had enough. So the technology itself, I'm guessing, given that we're going into a quantum nano age, it's going to see a progression towards the chip, the implant, the cloud will become a quantum cloud. It will be, you know, of course, the military are going to be the first on the road. Whoever doesn't have to worry about government standards and ethics will also be there. We don't need more tech. I think we need more people using the tech in good ways and sharing that and access being open. It's like we need a kind of...
There was a program on Radio 4 and it had a project that was being described using VR for people with psychosis and developing systems where the voice in the head was being, I mean, it seems a bit controversial to me, the voice in the head was being modeled in terms of timbre and tone, and then an avatar, so then a manifestation of the character, you know, within the subject's, you know, psychosis, let's say, was being managed by a therapist within a virtual world. I mean, it sounds like a science fiction scenario. Those kind of projects where you might have, you know, the psychologist, the writer, the VR technicians, you know, the coders, they can happen in a university setting where somebody's gone and, you know, managed to secure a big grant, and then the impact studies done around it, et cetera. But getting the VR projects made off the ground, distributed, and then get a return, let's say, so one can continue producing, must be very, very challenging.
I always concentrate on the actual relationship of things, something which I find is really the key of access also in the way we are seeing technology.
Turn the question around. What are the things that we don't want to put in the virtual world? I assisted in a conversation between two artists who created, one Indian artist and one Swiss artist, who created a video work, a virtual work together, like being far away. And the Swiss artist was Simon Sen, who works a lot with in the digital world. And the Indian artist was Roy Oberoi. She's a Bharatanatyam and contemporary dancer. And Simon wanted to make an archive of the Bharatanatyam with a motion capture. And she didn't like it. She said, you know, this art form is transmitted from generation to generation just by the voice. We don't film it, we don't tape it, that's how it's being transmitted. And she felt very uncomfortable towards her community in this tradition to think that it's going to be digitalized. And I really like that thought. So turning it around, what should we actually keep in our real world and not put in the digital one?
Because we're throwing anything we can to the digital and the virtual world right now. So is it a way of resolving? Throwing stuff around, you know? Eliane, we'd like to hear your voice before we close the session, if you'd like to participate.
Yeah, sure. I was listening because it was much more interesting than what I have to say, but I'll still challenge you with the last question maybe. And let me first introduce myself. I'm Elian Malouf. I'm a researcher also in computer science with a background in statistics. So I'm trying to mix more rigorous work from statistics with AI. Let's say we're calling it AI, but we're not really in the form of AI that you're thinking really about. We're in a much lower level. We're now still at the levels of, just making things work, some algorithms work, because we really don't understand more than that. I think the limitations we have here, it's more our brain and our capacity to formalize things better and put them in a computer and teach the computer how to work as intelligently as we do in a more intuitive way. And you were speaking through the whole session about moving from the physical to the virtual. And I couldn't put my finger on how much the fact that we are bodies actually influences whatever we're going to live inside the virtual world. You're getting into this virtual world, which might have other physical laws, let's say, but your body is still in the physical laws of the world that it grew in, right? And so there is this contradiction, and probably this is why it was shocking for you. And I'm wondering also about, before Kathleen, you were speaking about stepping in and stepping out of bodies from the virtual world as an opportunity to live other things. But is this really possible? Because how much the body is actually influencing whatever that we are experiencing. And it probably also comes back to Nicole's sensation of today, where she doesn't want to be into the virtual world at all and go really physical, to the dystopian situation where we don't use our bodies anymore and we're just connected to this purely virtual thing. And there, my question is, why do we need our bodies anymore? All these perceptions that we're having from the world, about the world, how much they actually need the body and need this physical world, and how much they can be disconnected from it. And maybe this question of psychedelics is probably a way to switch off this physical world that we perceive through our bodies and actually perceive some new laws, or maybe imagine or invent some new laws for it.
When we kind of think about the mind in the Western world, we only think about the brain. The perception of our body is definitely tied to all these connections, neural connections. Talking about memory, Nicole, you worked a lot with memory as well, how sound and images appear in memory. Memory is composed of synaptic connections. It's not actually a hard drive. It's not a physical space. It's connections that make up memories. So it's not that hard to trick the mind. And of course, we go into regions that are not necessarily related to technology, also to the more psychic aspect of humanity.
The body has so many access points for neurological kind of connection and pathways and knowledge. Fully convinced of that. But I do imagine a future also where our computational power and again, like quantum and nano work together to synthesize fully like the human experience in some way, in the way that the human genome, has mapped out the body. Or as sad as that is, I can imagine a future where at that point you have the potential to maybe reproduce without the use of the body, because you have enough AI learning through what the body goes through to be able to reproduce that.
How much happens actually when bodies gather in the same space? This concentration that happens, that is not just the brain, or it's this gathering in one space of a group of people who assist in a performance, and on the other side, artists who are offering a performance, and this exchange probably is not possible in a virtual world.
I'm just thinking of, generations to come. I've got a couple of grandchildren, and, they're on Minecraft all the time. The 10-year-old is learning Unity 3D on tutorials, in like quick bursts. on YouTube. It's extraordinary how much knowledge the older boy has in particular on the different platforms of making and creating things. And I had a discussion with him about creating a virtual world. He was quite scathing towards me in some different worlds, different generations and different familiarizations, and perhaps just like I like VR or the idea of it at the moment, in that it's defamiliarizing in terms of the body, the proprioceptive, cognitive, blah, blah. But maybe, my grandson's generation will go the other way. They're defamiliarized by having an exaggerated, enhanced sense of the natural world, of the physical.
Technological research is a desire to understand and desire to represent simple tools to reduce the huge dimension we are going towards, and they are helping us to be able to perceive things. But I'm quite sure that the virtual that we are able to generate inside ourselves, if we have the patience and if we can give time to this kind of virtuality that is inside us, we can discover much more. But it's a good tool. It is essential to have this superficial and this connection with superficial and depth of our dimension, our life.
Thank you so much. And I hope you had a good time as much as I have, and this feeling of lucidity that comes about.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for the invitation.
Thanks,
Very
Felix.
conversation.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Lovely
Have a
to meet
wonderful
you all.
afternoon.
Hope we can do it again. Yeah,
Yes.
and actually move on, create things. That'd be so good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
so much. Take care.